You're listening to the Sledgehammer Podcast with me, Paul Ebbs. This week we're going to be talking about Genesis of the Daleks with I Can't Think of a Genesis of the Daleks title writer pun, Emma Reeves. But first, a little bit of history. Back in 2017, I undertook to watch all of televised Doctor Who in one calendar year because I'm insane and have no life. I would start on January the 1st with An Unearthly Child and sledgehammer my way through, come hell, high water, or removal to the nearest psychiatric facility to December the 25th, finishing on Twice Upon a Time. What started out as the Doctor Who fans' equivalent of the Hajj rapidly turned into a project to try to understand how Doctor Who was written and is still being written. I would watch an episode, then immediately record my impressions on how it was constructed and plotted in what became the mammoth 350,000-word Sledgehammer Diary. With Doctor Who, often it's the facts and figures, the minutiae, the actors, producers and the special effects wizards who are lauded and picked over. But I've seen very few examples of Doctor Who stories being considered as pieces of writing. This podcast, I hope, will do that. Each week I'll have a conversation with someone who has written or still writes Doctor Who stories. I'll talk to them about why they think a particular story is worth exploring from a writing perspective and how they themselves go about writing their own Doctor Who fiction. Hopefully, at the end of each episode we'll have taken the bonnet off and had a good rummage around in the engines of the best Doctor Who stories and given you not only the encouragement to consider these stories afresh, but maybe some insights and inspiration to write your own. Genesis of the Daleks was broadcast in March and April 1975 as part of the 12th season of Doctor Who. It was written by Terry Nation, script edited by Robert Holmes, produced by Philip Hinchcliffe and directed by David Maloney. Importantly, for the conception of the story, it was commissioned by the previous production team of Barry Letts and Terence Dix, and this had a huge impact on not only the shape of the story, but on it even existing at all. Genesis is a story which pulls no punches in action and thematic depth. It is widely, and in my opinion rightly, viewed as an all-time classic, not only for Doctor Who, but television as a whole. If NASA had been more on the ball, they'd have put a copy of it on the Voyager spacecraft to teach aliens how to do telly properly. Writers Guild of Great Britain TV chair Emma Reeves, or award-winning Emma Reeves, as I am contractually obliged to refer to her, is one of the most respected screenwriters working in television for younger people today. As creator of Eve and the latest iteration of the Demon Headmaster, she is in the top echelon of writers of thoughtful and fun drama for children. Emma was lead writer on The Worst Witch, and she has written for The Dumping Ground, Hetty Feather, Tracey Beaker, and a long list of other great shows. She is a long-time Doctor Who fan and has written Doctor Who, Bernice Summerfield and Torchwood audios for Big Finish. Recently, she has adapted The Worst Witch into an Olivier Award WINNIng stage show and has been working on a forthcoming adaptation of My Mum Tracy Beaker for TV, and I am properly happy to have her here as a guest on Sledgehammer. Afternoon, Emma.
Afternoon.
How you doing?
I'm all right, thank you. How are you?
Oh, yeah, not so bad, not so bad. Good to see you. Tell us a bit about how you became a writer, why you're a writer, and some of the things that you've done.
Well, I started off as an actor, and I think from that I became interested in writing. I wrote some stage adaptations, partly of sort of books that interested me, and I then started writing screenplays. I did an MA at the University of East Anglia. Sort of sent things to the BBC, as you do. They were having various sort of competitions and initiatives, and I was part of a group at BBC Wales, which of Helen Rayner was part of the same group in about 2003 maybe. it was sort of to develop new writers, and it was just before Doctor Who obviously was, I think Doctor Who was sort of in the very early stage or the medium stages of development there by then. And anyway, through that, I was asked to write for the story of, I did an episode of Doctors and I did some radio plays, and I was asked to write for the story of Tracey Beaker, which was filmed in Wales at the time. And then sort of after that, I was asked to write on various children's shows. Young Dracula was one that I did a bit of. And sort of Tracey Beaker has been a sort of recurring theme throughout my life, because a few years later, I came back to work on Tracey Beaker Returns, which then became the dumping ground, which is running to this day. And I've recently written a 3-part adaptation of Jacqueline Wilson's novel, My Mum Tracy Beaker, in which Tracey Beaker is now a mum. So
brilliant.
Oh, and I also did some stage work at the same time. So I adapted Jacqueline Wilson's Hetty Feather for stage. And yes, and I also, because I've been a Doctor Who fan, since I was young, I was asked to write for Big Finish Torchwood, and I wrote a couple of Torchwoods, and I wrote a couple more things for Big Finish.
As a screenwriter, I know of you, and I know, I followed a lot of your work. I thought Eve was, fantastic. I thought, really, really good. And I love to see that the Demon Headmaster has come back as well, because that was something I really adored back in the good old days. And now it's still a very good show and such a great concept.
I love the Demon Headmaster. I mean, that I know it's so sort of, cliche to talk about things being a privilege, but I have sort of been very, very lucky to get to work on all sorts of wonderful material and wonderful books that I read as a kid. And I was also, I think I was a student at the time of the 96 adaptation, but I watched it anyway. It was such a big deal. And Terence Hardman's performance was so legendary. Because, and of course, Gillian, the author of the Demon Headmaster, had written a book in I think it was 2017 it was published, and this is what the CBBC had optioned, and it was written a modern version of it, and and it was absolutely about her concerns of where education was going, and and I think that there is this sort of pressure to return to this very authoritarian kind of 80s approach to schooling, and sort of superheads being brought in, and people going on about the importance of these old-fashioned values. So and at the same time, academies happening and corporate sponsorship happening in education. So obviously sort of a nod to the 80s 90s story, but also very much about education now. And and again, it's not just what we did, it's what Gillian did too. And I think Gillian deserves a lot of respect for it all. It all comes from her.
So let's get to the meat and potatoes of Sledgehammer this week. You've chosen Genesis of the Daleks, which is obviously fantastic. Could you tell us a little bit about why you've chosen it, as why you think it's good to talk about it from a writing perspective? I
mean, it is just it's just phenomenal. I mean, it's just all it just always blows me away just how great it is. So I just sort of thought, well, if we're celebrating good writing, couldn't do better.
When you say that you're a young fan, well, you are. I saw it when it went out. I was 9, so you've got that on me for a start. So obviously, I saw the original, then I read Terence's book, but I also had the record. I had there was a BBC record where the whole thing gets cut down into, and it still works. Yeah, and it still works. It's an object lesson in picking the right bits. It's about 45 minutes, 50 minutes, and I
suppose it probably would have had to have been to fit onto a side.
Sit onto a record,
LP.
Yeah.
Yes.
So it was an old LP. It's brilliant. I've loved the story forever since I saw it. It had a huge impact on me. And watching it again yesterday, I was struck by how, on the surface, it's just an action movie, but when you get into it, there's so many moral questions going on.
I don't know. I mean, it just does so many things right, doesn't it? I mean, it's sort of from the moment it starts. You sit down and of course there's a slight cliffhanger from the Centauran experiment before it sort of like, oh, they've gone off in a transmat beam. Where's he going to wind up? And but the Doctor's there. He's given a mission from the Time Lords. Then he gets Sarah and Harry join him, and they're immediately in peril. And
yes,
we know that there have been occasions in Doctor Who history where 6-parters or 7-parters have been deemed to have dragged or needed padding, and
yes,
and this one, it's just, I think if you've got a clear through line to take you through, and so because I mean we'll get to it later, but obviously it's got some just beautifully written scenes. It explores some wonderful moral dilemmas, but it just starts off with like what's taking you through the story. The Doctor has a mission, and he has no choice but to accept this mission. He can't send his companions to safety because they're stuck there with him. They can't get out till they use the time ring. And
I'm really struck by how much the first episode is just death. What's really interesting about the writing, I think, in that first episode is it doesn't let up. It doesn't take a breath.
Yes.
I think Robert Holmes has really. I know it's Terry Nation's script, and one of the things we always have to think about is that the writers of Doctor Who, especially in that time, are a gestalt entity. I used this phrase before when I was speaking to Martin. But what's going on in that first episode is so dark, and you know, Sontaran Experiment was quite dark. There's quite a lot of torture in Sontaran Experiment. The Ark in Space is terrifying. Robot was, you know, pretty much, you know, King Kong, but it was joyous compared to this. And even in a season where you've had Ark in Space and Sontaran Experiment, the first episode of Genesis of the Daleks feels like we've gone even darker.
Yeah, it absolutely does. And it's got that, obviously, the sort of Jonah Louis Stop the Cavalry thing of like, it's all wars rolled into one. It feels World War One. It feels World War Two. It feels older than that. It feels newer than that. But I just wanted to go back to what you were saying about the Gestalt entity, because I think this is one of the absolute strengths of Doctor Who, and this particular juncture in time is sort of like it could not be stronger, because as we know, but as you know, every single listener might not know, Terence Dicks originally commissioned it. Terry Nation brought him a story. According to Terence Dicks, he famously said, "It's a great story, Terry. Trouble is, you've just sold it to me several times before. Can we have something new?" And of course, Terence Dicks claims that he then said, "What about the Star Doctor?" But you know, you've got. But and then of course, so by the time Terry Nation's writing, you've had the handover. So it was commissioned by Terence Dicks and Barry Letts, and then then they go, and Robert Holmes comes in as script editor, and Hinchcliffe comes in, and of course you've got Terry Nation. So you've got 5 of the absolute giants of Doctor Who all working on it together. And I think as a TV writer, as a screenwriter, this is what's so interesting for us, because genuinely, you know, TV is collaborative, and it's not necessarily a great place for auteurs, and I think or for people who get too self-indulgent. And I think, you know, these are all 5 very strong men who know their own mind, you know, and there are sort of later clashes over the whole, you know, brain of Morbius land thing.
Yeah.
But actually what happens, even if the participants aren't always happy about it, what happens in collaboration is sometimes a masterpiece. And this is one.
I think from what reading around it, I don't think it would have happened if Terence hadn't suggested doing the genesis of doing the beginning of the Daleks, because Robert Holmes was not that into the Daleks. He wasn't, you know, from what I can gather, he wouldn't have commissioned this, you know, in the first place. And because Barry Letts, I think, was executive producing, keeping an eye on the program as they moved from their team to the new team, if Terence and Barry hadn't made it a really interesting concept for Robert to get his teeth into, we might never have had it anyway. So I think the fact that it might never have happened is really interesting. Imagine a Doctor Who without Genesis of the Daleks.
I know. I mean, you know, this really is one of those, which of course you get many of them in Doctor Who, but this is one of those moments where everything changes, and you know, you just see such sort of wonderful new world of possibilities.
The first 3 episodes of it are pretty much bang, 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 lots of action. So the moral dimension is encroaching episode by episode. It's really well structured in that thing, because we know in hindsight that we're heading towards that one moment where the Doctor says, "Do I have the right?" which is the most amazing moment, probably one of the most amazing moments in all Doctor Who, because it underlines who the Doctor is.
Yes.
And I'd love to know, and I don't know, and I don't know if you know, if it was in Terry's original, Nation's original, or if that's something that developed later. I mean, I don't know, but it's heading towards that moment. The Doctor has been asked to commit genocide. He has been asked to pretty much commit genocide. From your point of view, if you'd have been tasked with writing Genesis of the Daleks or something like Genesis of the Daleks, how would you have gone around it in the same way? Is that the moral nub for you?
Well, with hindsight, it's the perfect way. So yes, I would do that because I've seen Genesis of the Daleks.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay.
But I think, yeah, absolutely. I mean, and that's the thing, like, he's been given a mission. And of course, the Time Lords in a very, in what would become, and of course, well, I say we'll never know. Actually, I'm sure some scholars will pop up and go, actually, we do know. And I'd be very grateful to know how the drafts went and what's it. But it's already beginning to feel very Robert Holmes, because obviously what he will go on to do with the Time Lords and the Deadly Assassin and things. And it's sort of, Time Lords are, even though they're on the verge of, they pretty much do execute the Doctor in the War Games, you're still sort of, they still sort of have this veneer of being good. But in this, they set him up, they offer him options, but one of them is genocide. And then sort of later on, he says, well, I had 3 options from the Time Lords and they've run out. My only option now is genocide. And it's sort of like, oh, the Time Lords so knew that. That's what they wanted,
Here's an interesting, just a sidelight here. You write a lot for younger people. Could Genesis of the Daleks be made for that time slot now? It's as violent as it is.
I think and
complex.
It's interesting. I mean, I think one of the frustrations of, this is quite detailed sort of CBBC thing, but one of the problems of writing for young people in the last 15 years or so is that it was moved on to its own specific CBBC channel, whereas like at the time Genesis of the Daleks, even though it was seen as a children's show and a tea time slot, and the shows I watched in the 80s, they were on the main channel, and it was assumed that if a child was too traumatized, the parent might switch it off for them. But with CBBC, it has been very frustrating of what we're not allowed to do, because the fact that it was on a channel on its own kind of meant historically that parents, or it was assumed that parents would almost use it as a babysitter. So you couldn't have anything on which would be too upsetting for a particularly sensitive 6-year-old. But I think also, I mean, times were different. When this was made, we were sort of less than 30 years away from World War II, and the sort of the realities of war were less to sort of be a bit more positive about the future of children's TV. As things go to iPlayer first, which is going to be more about the content than the channel, I hope that there will be a chance to sort of show bolder stories. The shootings and the overt violence in Genesis of the Daleks. Interestingly, of course, you could do it in Doctor Who. You just couldn't do it on CBBC. As Doctor Who has always had this, because when I'm trying to get something through that they don't want, I would always argue, well, they did something much worse in Doctor Who, and they'd say, oh, Doctor Who's different.
Doctor Who's different.
It's not part of the children's department. But I think the moral complexity in Genesis of the Daleks is something which you could certainly do for children, and absolutely should. And I think that you definitely have baddies. I mean, there are definitely some people in the story who are much worse than others. Neither the Thals or the Carlaids are the good side, which is a brilliant choice, because it would have been very easy for them to have made the Thals the good side.
Yeah.
So vicious endeavours like the rocket building could have been. I mean, I don't think you could ever justify the slavery, but
no.
Obviously putting in the slavery shows that the Thals are just as bad as
the
Khaleds, and I think by not having team good, you sort of take away that thing of the end justifies the means.
Yes,
which is so you're absolutely setting up the Doctor's moral dilemma from early on. When the Time Lord first says destroy the Daleks, I just imagine being a child and seeing the words "the genesis of the Daleks" coming up on the screen. It would just be like, what a moment that would have been to know.
I just wind back there to the moral complexity of the fact that both sides are pretty much Nazis. I think that's a really good turnaround as well, because the Thals have always been good. They've always been good before that. If you go back to a story which I absolutely love, which is Planet of the Daleks. I adore Planet of the Daleks. It's the best Sunday afternoon war movie ever made in the history of Doctor Who. I think it's marvelous. The Thals were good. They're blonde and they're beautiful and they're good. Yes. But in Genesis of the Daleks, they're just as much as Nazis as the Khaleds, who are awful, and only good person in it, the only really good character in it, is Severin, the mutant, who is hated by both sides.
I love Severin. I was thinking about how great it is, and he's brave and he's got agency. He's a brilliant character. Imagining it from a sort of a young person's perspective, when the Time Lords go stop the Daleks from being created, part of you goes, brilliant. What a brilliant idea. What a brilliant solution. Oh dear, the word solution. And then of course, and then the Time Lord goes, oh, you could do this. And you're thinking, okay, yes, maybe there is an alternative, and then to genocide. And as you say, the idea of the Thals being beautiful and blonde and therefore good, thankfully, is turned on its head with the idea that Severin the mutant being the only truly good person they meet.
Yes,
possibly Garman, although
but Garman was one of the elite, and and Ronson. They were people who they're the people of the Nuremberg trials who said, well, I was only following orders. I'd have been killed if I didn't kill all those Jewish people. They're Dr. Mengele.
Yes,
that's who they really are. And there's another interesting parallel as well. Davros, who is our baddie, is disabled.
Yes.
And he's the worst person, but the best person in it is also disabled. And I think that there's a lovely resonance between the two. They're both broken people, and they've both chosen to go in different directions. And I think that's worth thinking about. Also, the other thing I wanted to think about, and I don't know if you've noticed this, but most of the Barry Letts, Terence Dicks, John Pertwee era was pretty much anti-science. I know the Doctor's a scientist, but there were lots of evil scientists, and there was the dinosaurs and
Inferno.
Yes,
just because you can doesn't mean you should.
Yes. That's another continuation. It's almost as if it's John Pertwee season part the 5th. Science is the enemy. Scientists can be evil. It's not politicians who are evil in pretty much all. There are a couple of stupid politicians like Chin in Axos, but politics isn't the thing that makes the world bad. It's science, and I think that definitely comes from Barry Letts and what he believed.
It's very interesting, isn't it? Because obviously we don't know if the Thals have an equivalent of the Khaled scientific elite. I assume they don't. Well, I mean, they've got their rocket, but we don't sort of see a Davros and Garman equivalent. But the scientific elite are almost they seem to be they are above. I suppose they're down to boy generals, and they're above the military and the politicians. Everything is a very stark warning of don't do this. Isn't it? And I suppose it's obviously doing a great disservice to scientists, because obviously I'm sure there are very many very moral scientists, but it's sort of like Davros was, to coin a phrase, following the science.
Yes, he was.
finding out what the final mutated form would be, and then he went, and I will create this casing. But then of course he started leading the science, because then he started messing around with the actual So it's interesting. And we've come back to the thing of what might be considered conventional beauty or ugliness in the appearance, because of course one of the things, and it's obviously been an ongoing thing of Doctor Who, of like, with our human standards, the appearance of the interior Dalek creatures is disgusting to us, but then who are we to say what's disgusting? And of course we're all sort of repelled by the mutated Khalid creature because because it used to be human, it doesn't look right anymore. But actually, there is a sort of discussion going on in the story that, so what if you're a blob with tentacles? You're still probably lovely to other blobs with tentacles. The problem is what Davros does to the minds of these creatures. So I think that's very interesting that that's put in, and that that's also what ultimately turns his fellow scientists against him. So some of them do have morals. Although, as you say, they're still culpable.
They got there. They got there, didn't they? Yeah. Sorry, yes.
But I think, even they draw the line when the mental engineering that he wants to remove their compassion and turn them into what he thinks are going to be apex predators, sort of the most successful in the food chain, but that they're repelled by that. And it's sort of, so I suppose there is a sort of a hopefully a positive sort of moral there, that it doesn't matter what you look like on the outside, it's what's inside that matters.
I think that's an excellent observation there. One of the underlying themes of it, that it doesn't matter what you look like on the outside. Severin, Davros, it's the Daleks, it's what you think, what you feel. And I think in terms of character motivation for Davros, there is that other there are two amazing scenes in it. One is obviously the as we said, do I have the right? But it's also to hold in my hand a file that would end everything. We never find out why Davros got to that point. Do you think that's needed in Genesis to understand him better? As he is, he's just evil.
Yes.
We never really get. I know that Big Finish have done some of his backstory with Lance's I Davros, which I haven't heard for years, so I don't remember that much about them.
I remember really enjoying I Davros, but when I listened to it, I can't remember it in much detail, I'm afraid. But I do remember very much enjoying it at the time. But I think canon-wise, we can sort of still probably make up our own.
Yes.
But I mean, I think that is a wonderful scene. And of course, it's kind of, that famous speech kind of ends in bathos when because of he's so carried away by his own narcissism that the Doctor's able to ambush him. It's the sort of thing which in sort of modern movies would be like, don't monologue. You see what happens when you monologue.
But that's interesting.
But it's a wonderful
the moral stew. But that's interesting as well, because when the Doctor takes his hand, he tortures Davros. He turns off his life support system.
Absolutely. You are now bullying a man in a wheelchair. That is not the perfect hero look for you.
We know the Doctor. If you look at the history, he's committed genocide many times. He has. The Doctor. What's the story where they said you would make a good Dalek? Oh, it's Dalek, isn't it? Rob's. You would be a good Dalek, and it's true. It's absolutely true. The Doctor takes positions. He takes sides. In the moment that, we always go on about the Doctor never carries a gun. He's never cruel or cowardly. Well, in that moment, he didn't have a gun, but he was cruel and he was a coward.
Yes.
He turned off his life support system in front of him. And I think that again gives us wonderful grist to the morally complex mill that Genesis of the Daleks is.
It absolutely does. And I think, the thing which sort of saves the Doctor, and absolutely he doesn't always do it. And there are many examples throughout the Doctor's history where he or her commits genocide. And so sometimes the Doctor feels bad about it. Sometimes they don't.
They had that Scooby laugh at the end.
But in this, which is why it's so good, in this, he tries to get out of it because he doesn't want to have to make that. And there's a wonderful bit, I think it's in episode 6, where he says to Garman, thank you, because he thanks Garman for not having to make the choice.
Yes.
Because the Doctor is the one who always has to make these choices. And I mean, he must have known deep down that obviously, no, actually he doesn't, I think. I think possibly he thought at that point it's sorted, and obviously that Garman and the rest of the elite would succeed. But I just thought it's nice that he thanks him for taking that horrible choice out of his hands, because, I think also, obviously sometimes the Doctor goes backwards, but I think, if you imagine the Doctor as an evolving character, I think this is a good time of moral growth. I
think you're right. I like to think in my backstory head, with something that's going on, maybe, it just in the machinations, that there would have just a line or something to suggest that the Doctor knew he went too far when he tortured Davros, and that's what trips him into, should I put those two wires together? And I think that, I don't want to get ahead of us here, but I think the speech that he makes at the end about, it will bring people together. Having the Daleks as an enemy, there will some good will come out of it. It will bring people together, and I think that ties up the morality. We can go through all of these really difficult situations, and we can, worry about the morals of things, but at the end, some good will come out of, good comes out of tragedy. What's it? Let's say it's an ill wind that blows no good, as they say.
And I think just going back to the torture, I think to defend the Doctor, to be fair, that Davros had just tortured Sarah and Harry, but then if the Doctor was to go round as he sometimes tries to do, taking revenge for all the bad things people have done, then he'd never get, he would never get done being torturing and killing himself. So I suppose sometimes you have to draw the line and say it stops here, and and I think he does give Davros and the Daleks several chances in this. Well, no, I was going to say the Silurians, but Silurians is a completely different setup, really, because actually the poor Silurians, have got a strong claim to be be the victims.
But they do have an evil scientist.
They do have an evil scientist. I was just thinking of, the Doctor, this sort of thing which we sort of saw particularly in the Russell T Davies, to accept the Moffat versions of the show, of the Doctor giving people chances. Putting is this an early-ish example of the Doctor thinking through and giving people a chance, so he doesn't have to make
I think
decisions.
I think what's interesting about Genesis of the Daleks from the Doctor's character is that it does show the difficult path he has to tread. I think it's a great story about Doctor Who. It's a great piece of writing about Doctor Who in terms of there's always that thing, and I tried to do it in a Doctor Who story I wrote, an audio I wrote years ago for an amateur group. What would the Doctor do if he had a weapon that could destroy Hitler and stop the Second World War? Would he use it? And he makes the decision not to. And I think that probably comes directly from Genesis of the Daleks, and it occurs to me now, and it's never occurred to me before, that maybe the bit where the Doctor is torturing the Dalek in Dalek is very much the moral complexity of the moment has got to him. It's broken him. I think that's
a very good point.
I think in terms of we're talking about writing now. We've done the moral complexity, and we've uncovered some really interesting stuff there. In terms of it as a piece of writing, as a script, what do you value about Genesis of the Daleks? Apart from that moral complexity,
I love a lot of the dialogue. I think there are just so many wonderful scenes in it. I think it is well structured and paced. It's a 6-parter isn't that easy to do, and I think it does it wonderfully. And I think the way it sort of makes you think.
In terms of 6-parters, one of the things, as you know, I did this. I watched all of Doctor Who in 1 year.
Yes.
And I wrote my diary. And one of the things that I'd noticed that I hadn't noticed before about 6-parters is the best ones have a dog leg where they go somewhere else. So Seeds of Doom has got a 2-episode dog leg at the beginning, and then a 4-episode story, and it's great. And I love the Time Monster as well. When it goes to Atlantis, it's got a great dog leg. Genesis of the Daleks works as a 6-parter without any dog leg at all. And I think that's the pace and momentum that Holmes and Nation have put into that script.
From when I was a kid, and obviously it sort of came from obviously Terence Dicks's adaptation of the novel. They're just like, I think it's got so many sort of memorable moments. Like I think Sarah's experience being tortured as a slave of the Thals and her attempt to climb up the rocket. I mean, I think it is I think, as you say, it's a bit of a shame that their heroic escape attempt ultimately goes nowhere. But,
yes.
But it's a very powerful moment for the companion. Only 30 years later, and is sort of like in the shadow of World War II. And I think, considering that Harry's there, and writers of the time quite often preferred to give quite a lot of any sort of weighty intellectual debate to the men. I think it's interesting that the have I the right scene takes place dialogue-wise pretty much entirely between Sarah and
the Doctor, yeah.
Because Sarah has met the Daleks before, and so it feels like giving a voice to the victims. So it's almost like having a Jewish person argue about killing Hitler.
She's well in with genocide, isn't she? She wants them dead. And
it's interesting because she's I suppose as a Doctor companion relationship, because often it's there's often a sort of a perception and often particularly in the modern series, derived from things the Doctor himself has said, that he kind of needs a human to keep him good, to keep him on the straight and narrow. And in this case, the human's arguing for genocide, and the Doctor's the one that's wavering.
Absolutely. Just from a script writing point of view, one of the things that always stick out like a sore thumb to me when I'm watching stuff, and I always get a little bit annoyed about it, I don't get annoyed about in Genesis of the Daleks, and that's the capture escape loop. Yes. where a writer will just have them escape and get captured just to tread water for for 10 minutes in a script. And I often point that out, the capture escape loop, it's just pointless. But it's carried out, the capture escape loops early on in the first 3 episodes. There are several capture escape loops up the rocket, and when the Doctor and Harry get out. However, the verve and the pace and the craft of those scenes works for me. I think, although it's just a water treading capture escape loop, the try to escape from the rocket, you get them all the way there. And I love that scene, whereas normally a capture escape loop would just, piss me right off, as they say.
I mean, I think it absolutely gets away with it, and I think it's sort of, I think a script editor might sort of point that out in because I think sort of obviously the way we sort of write now, we're very aware that it will be for people watching it again and again, and you sort of want the story to keep innovating. Whereas, of course, at the time they were writing for, assumed it would be here one Saturday, gone the next Saturday. So you can sort of fake people out with when she drops from the rocket and it looks like it's going along there, and she just sort of falls about 2 feet. But I think just what's so wonderful about the writing is just despite not being written for people to watch nearly 50 years later, it still stands up. You note these things, but it doesn't put me off the story. I still think it's a wonderful story. The Doctor and Harry have gone to the Thal City, and you're like, oh God, how will you be met there? Because they've enslaved Sarah, and you've been constantly locked up by the Khalids, and then suddenly we're just told, oh yeah, they're there and they're talking to the top Thals. Like, okay, so we sort of cut out a whole load of potential escape loops there, and probably for the best, because it's actually sort of like, well, we've had in episodes 1, 2 a lot of mechanics of being sort of wrongly imprisoned and not allowed to talk to the top guy. Why not just let's just cut straight to it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the other characters I wanted to talk about as well was Betan, who is worth talking about because apparently, again, I'm reading around it, she was a male character in the original script and then got changed. I don't know if it was Maloney who changed her when he cast the part, but I think that was very interesting for the time to have a woman freedom fighter, which kind of, I suppose it's echoed from the I've forgotten the character's name in Day of the Daleks. But it goes against Doctor Who type for the time, I think.
Yes, and it's funny because maybe I already knew that, or maybe I just subliminally sort of somehow inferred it because that is one of the things I was thinking about when I was actually last watching it, and I was thinking, I wonder if this character was originally written to be a man, and and I think. And sometimes when you've got, a lot of different sort of military or quasi-military people who you have to sort of differentiate as of one way of doing it. Can be like, look, remember this one because she's a girl,
Yes.
and she does stand out for that reason. But I think, but for whatever reason that she is cast, I think it's great, and I think that sort of she sort of has to make some tough decisions and is sort of left at the end. But you know, she is one of the nearest things to goodies that.
But she's another one like this. She's another one like the scientific elite who was okay to be there and watch the genocide of the Khalids. It was only when they won that she became a bit nicer.
Yes.
And I like that there was, again, this is probably not scripted and outside our orbit, really, but I like the way there was no compromises to femininity or anything. Short-haired, army dress, and it didn't matter that she was a woman in that sense. But, but it's good to see, I think. So, I value her as a character for going against Doctor Who type, really.
Yes. Yes, I do. I was just trying to remember the name of, because I just think of another interesting character moment. What's one of the strengths of this story, and what Doctor Who, often does really well, and it's interesting because they do it for often a very young audience. Is that the character who is not a monster, not all bad, just a human who is doing the best they can under difficult circumstances. And I think it's sort of like it's quite an accurate sort of portrayal of war, and that sort of like, the Thals are not monsters, but they do monstrous things. Davros is the one who is a monster, but there is some definitely Davros looking like a wheelchair user is kind of problematic, but it is, as we said, the story kind of emphasized that it's not the outward trappings that matter, it's what's in your mind, and he's only a monster because of what his mind is, because of the way he thinks makes him a monster. Anyway, there's the moment which is quite sweet, and I can't remember, it's one of the leading Thals when they think the war is over and they've won.
Yeah.
Like, should we execute the Doctor and Harry? Yes. Oh no, wait, no, let's not. And that sort of, but like we've had enough. And it's sort of, it's sort. I know when I said like that, it sounds like a ridiculous moment, and it sort of is. But it's sort of, but I think it's the idea of we're just being monsters for as long as we have to. Once this unpleasant task is done, we will go back to normal life, and many of us are quite nice people, really. And I think, obviously, as saying, sort of only 30 years out of a war that a lot of people involved in it would have remembered, that sort of, and of course, as we know, sort of PTSD and things, it doesn't quite work like that. But the idea of we're just going to do terrible things for a while, and then once the problem is solved, we'll stop being terrible people, and we'll all be lovely again. And of course, and the writing is very much, no, it doesn't work like that. It can't work like that. But I just thought that's an interesting moment.
I think you're right. It is a very interesting moment. It's the selflessness of Severin as well, which is he's the only real person in it who wants to make who's happy to make a sacrifice as well. And that's a nice counterpoint to what you're saying there, in the fact that we're going to be bad and horrible. Well, we have to be, and we'll stop and we'll be nice. Severin doesn't become that person. Severin is, so that's, again, it's a nice counterpoint.
But a good thing about the performance and the writing is the trope that it isn't, which is he appears to have no sexual interest in Sarah particularly. He's just doing this because he's good.
Yes.
He's just empathy for a fellow being, it's not, it doesn't particularly come across that he's doing all this because he fancies her necessarily.
He is the complete counterpoint to the Daleks. So we've come to the end of our time on Genesis and the Daleks. I just wanted to think, was there anything that you hadn't got a chance to say, or anything that you wanted to sum up?
Yeah, I think summing up, I love Genesis and the Daleks because it's sort of so well written. It's technically very, very well written. It's sort of, as a piece of television, it keeps the interest. It sort of never feels like the narrative is flagging. It's driven on by we know what the Doctor needs to do, and the Doctor has this mission driving him on. But then, due to everything that he encounters on the way, he rethinks his mission and questions the mission. And there are just so many wonderful pieces of writing and dialogue in it. Yeah, what can I say? Just watch it all. It's amazing.
Yeah. thanks for that, Emma. That was a brilliant discussion there. We really got into the nitty-gritty, which I really enjoyed. It's such a well-written story. What I want to focus on now for the second half of the podcast is you, basically, and you as a writer. And I want to talk to you in particular about screenwriting, which is a thing obviously I've dabbled in a bit as well. So it's something, it's close to my heart. It's my favourite part of what I do as a writer. Why do you write scripts and not anything else?
I think it's probably because, as I said, I started out as an actor. I often approach things from a point of view of acting out all the parts in my head, and that's the sort of the bit I enjoy. I mean, as you know, the actual job of a screenwriter is writing endless outlines and pitches for a lot of your actual working day. But the bit that I really enjoy, and I'm really out to do it, is just imagine myself into the role of everybody in a story and sort of work out sort of, okay, what's happening? What are they doing? How are they trying to get it? What's going on? I often sort of say something about the amounts of words that novelists have to write. I'm absolutely in awe. Whereas screenwriters, we can get a lot of pages just because the fact that most of it's blank space. So there is that. But I think it's because that's sort of what brought me into it, that I sort of came from acting. And I think still the part I probably enjoy most about it is sort of like acting it out in my head or out loud, but just playing all the parts and working out why people do what they do.
I had an interesting conversation about this very subject with Rob Shearman on the last podcast.
He does it all, doesn't he?
He does. And I said to him that I'm going to reach through the Zoom and strangle you, because he didn't have to write a single outline for Dalek.
Oh,
nothing.
That because
Russell said that Russell said to him that your process, that doesn't work for you, so go off and write. And what Rob said to me was, if I'm writing an outline, I might as well do the dialogue while I'm doing it. And and so he didn't have to do what what I did on Doctors or Casualty or The Bill. And you do for the things, as you said, endless outlines, scene breakdowns, and what have you. How do you stop it becoming boring? You've done the story, you've done it all in your one pager, your outline, your scene breakdown. How do you stop it, your script, from the idea of running out of steam? I mean,
that is a genuine issue, actually. It's interesting that you said that Rob didn't have to do it for Russell, because I was at a talk yesterday, which no doubt we'll come back to later, but Russell T. Davies was talking about It's a Sin, and he said this many times anyway in his book, but he doesn't outline, but he recognizes that he's got to a certain stature in the industry where he's allowed to not outline. But I'm pleased to know he extends that privilege to people who work with him as well, because I think there is a danger. I mean, I suppose one thing that does keep things fresh is things often change a lot as you write you write them. But I think it depends what show you're working on, because I think frustratingly, I think certain shows seem to want everything pinned down, and as I think you mentioned in your introduction, I also am television chair of the Writers Guild, and so we're quite often in conversations with heads of continuing drama and similar, about how they and the producers and script editors work with writers and how they treat them. And I think one of the frustrations on continuing dramas can quite often be that people want everything very much pinned down by it on an outline, then they decide they didn't like it. And so, I think it's about sort of the culture of people not wanting to take risks. But I think sometimes it can sometimes be a feeling of release when you finally hear the words go to script. You've done several outlines. It can sort of be great. Here's a chance to actually put down all these ideas. Depending on how good your relationship is with the people who are going to be reading, giving you the next set of notes. Sometimes there is a joy of knowing you can just throw a load of stuff out because you were just putting it in there to sort of over explain the story to people who need to read it, and actually now you've got the characters to do it. You don't need that anymore. It's all about having good relationships with the people you're working with and sort of and mutual trust, really. I think so. Obviously someone like Russell is in a great position because he can very much pick exactly who he wants to work with, and
Yes.
and only work with people who get it and get him. Whereas that's not always the case for people like me.
I stared at the phone from about 2005 to 2010. It never rung. Cheers, Russell. Oh. Cheers, Russell.
I know. Well, absolutely guttingly, shortly after Doctor Who, I know he kind of vowed that he would never showrun again because life's too short and he just wanted to write all his personal projects. But maybe he'll now decide that like It's a Sin was so wonderful that he doesn't need to do any more personal projects, and he can now run some shows and give us a job.
I'll have my nose pressed up against his window like Tiny Tim in Christmas Carol. He's the toy shop. Screenwriting. We're going to have people listening to the podcast who've never written a script. So give me what's your script 101?
I'd probably try to avoid telling people how to write a script as much as I can, but sometimes
imagine I've got a gun to your head.
Yes. So sometimes you're in the position where people I get asked to mentor people, or people are asking for advice. I mean, I think most of the sort of script ones are probably quite cliched, but sort of like, tell the story you really want to write, tell the story that only you can write. Again, Russell T Davies said something in the talk yesterday, but he was saying somebody asked him how to be a fearless writer, and he sort of said, well, just be fearless. But I think if you don't try to second guess necessarily what people want, I think people see shows maybe aren't very good or are sort of cliched, and they'll sort of kind of try to write down to that. And I would just sort of say, like, try to make it as different and interesting as you possibly can. Try and write what excites you. I think probably don't be boring is 101, which, but I suppose the reason I hesitate to give any screenwriting advice is because I just imagine people grabbing bits of my own work and going, but look what you did here. Yeah. Or sort of like, well, I find this really boring. And, sometimes I would go, yes, I agree, but I didn't intend it to be boring when I wrote it. I was trying to be interesting at the time.
I don't think anybody goes out of their way to write boring stuff. And, I could always point to stuff that I've written and say, this doesn't work for whatever reason. One of the things that's difficult and for people to grasp is they often put too many words in a script.
Do you know what? I was just thinking that, yes, and being concise is such an art of TV writing. And I think another thing to remember is, I mean, I love doing the dialogue. It's a fun bit, but it's and it's interesting because, like, when I was a kid, I used to read Empire, the film magazine, as many people did, and they used to always have a sort of scene of the month, and it would be, obviously, it was a magazine, so it was written, and it would be a scene and a dialogue heavy scene, and usually with some amazing dialogue, and you'd think, oh yeah, I want to be like those screenwriters. But great dialogue is an aspect of screenwriting. It's not it's kind of not the main thing. And I think it's sort of like, it's very much awarded and praised and people love it, but it's kind of writing how people speak is overrated, like literally how people speak.
Yes.
Because
never do that.
What you need to do is create something that sounds as if people could be saying it, but also particularly in screenwriting, as concisely as you possibly can. And refine it again and again, but try and make it sound as if somebody could say it. But imagine if, and everything in screenwriting has to be so information rich, as sort of pretty much, every sentence, even just, something which may look sort of supposedly easy to write, like say the Demon Headmaster. It's actually, trying to get these stories told and sort of trying to get so much information packed into every line is very difficult. Just a thought on dialogue, because I've also done theatre, as you know, and I've worked on some shows which have been partly devised or partly improvised. And I've been in rehearsal rooms with casts, and they'll do a great improvisation of say a scene from a book. I will write it down verbatim, and sometimes I will write it down and then I will fiddle with it. And sort of sometimes that there have been occasions where I've written down what people improvised, and exactly that, and then given that to them as a script to read. And suddenly, even though that's exactly what they said, when they're reading it from a script, it seems stilted, there are enormous pauses, and it takes 6 times as long. So you kind of, you don't necessarily. It sounded natural when they were actually improvising, but as soon as they're reading a script, it didn't at all. So you kind of need to sort of find a kind of a language which works and which isn't sort of completely putting the audience off because they're consciously thinking nobody ever speaks like that ever. You need to find a language that works for you and for the actors, I guess.
Exposition. So getting the information, the necessary information to the audience is really difficult to do well, because you don't want to have a character just say, oh, well, this is happening and I feel like this because, but it's really important. You've got to, the phrase I use is smuggling exposition. You've got to smuggle it in.
Yes, you have.
How do you approach that?
I think I kind of have a sort of, and again, people will no doubt point to many transgressions in my work, but I kind of have a sort of, I try to have an inner rule of, if somebody's saying, as we both know, then you're potentially in trouble. Because of course, as writers, we're all armchair critics as well, and I see scripts written by the most sort of acclaimed writers in the land, and I sort of think, how did you get away with that? These two people are telling each other facts that they would have most definitely known for the benefit of the audience. So I always sort of I try to think of how can there be a problem that's happening now and something that needs to be talked about now, but that brings with it some implied knowledge that the audience can then infer.
And that's the real skill, isn't it? That's a real skill. And I think, you've been very self-deprecating and say, I'm sure people could point to bits of my work, but you wouldn't keep getting work if you didn't do this well. And that's,
one would hope so.
So take your self-deprecation on the chin, right? Because I know you're really good at this. But smuggling in exposition, there are scenes in some programs I cringe at, because nobody tells somebody else what they already know. Yes. There's no point to it, and there's a particular problem with this in some audio and radio writing that I've heard over the years. And I don't know if you know, but a good few years ago there was a spoof radio play made called "The Gun in My Right Hand Is Loaded."
Yes, and I know the one. It's written by an actor, wasn't it?
I think so.
A famous actor.
Yeah, but I can't remember who wrote it. But it's all about how not to do radio writing. Right, and there are some absolute clangers, and you can tell, even like you said, really great writers just can't do it. They cannot do it, or they can't do it. There's a without slagging people off, I'm not going to. There's some writer that I really admire. Some of their audio work is pretty terrible.
Audio is very, very challenging. I find it very challenging, and I sort of feel like I'm when I'm writing audio, I feel like I'm sort of several sort of degrees or steps behind where I am in screenwriting in terms of and I still and I do know the sort of spoof you mean, and it haunts me as I try to write for radio because it is a difficult thing, and it's quite good to sort of switch media, because you become aware of your own kind of tics and sort of things that you rely on. And I just realize sort of quite often I will sort of, in visual, particularly in screen and particularly in TV writing, I will sort of end a scene by sort of two people are doing something and like a third party comes in and sort of like, and they're like, oh shit, character X is here, and sort of it changes the dynamic, and then you sort of cut away, and it sort of and it kind of works on screen. Can't do that in audio. No. Or when I try to do it in audio, it just never seems to work for me, and I sort of realize, okay, that's a crutch I've been relying on in screenwriting.
just to put your mind at rest, I listened to 2 episodes of Moons of Volpana yesterday, and you get a big tick. You get a big tick from it. You get a big. There were no moments where I said, "Oh no, she can't do it." Oh no, what am I going to say?
Thank you.
So big tick. And I'll finish off Moons of Volpana probably tomorrow. So constructing our scripts, we've talked a little bit about outlines, and we've talked a little about scene breakdowns, and we've talked a bit about exposition, creating characters. Now you do a lot of adaptations.
Yes.
And, that's fair enough. For your own stuff, for, like Eve, how do you create characters? What do you do? What's your process?
In a way, all characters are sort of you. not you, Paul, but your characters are probably sort of you, and my characters are sort of me, and I think they're all kind of aspects. And I think with Lily, I think I made a conscious decision. Lily, who was the sort of the girl next door and friend of Eve's best friend. I mean, Eve was a really interesting one because as an actor, you're often sort of talked about, well, imagine if, or like act as if. So imagine if this happened to you, how would you react to this? Or if you've been brought up in this way, how would you feel? Or if all your life people had told you this, how would you feel? I think Eve was an interesting one because, and again, it's not perfect, but it's like an exercise in what if you hadn't been brought up as a human with all the sort of biases and subliminal ideas that we get programmed with before we're even aware of them. What if you are a blank canvas in many ways? And that was very interesting because it's almost like sort of writing a kind of anti-character in a way, but of course she becomes a very strong character. Because obviously, as I said, I did that MA, and I've sort of read a lot of books on screenwriting, and like a lot of the time, I sort of see them as like tools to be used when things aren't working. And I think if you watch an absolutely brilliant show and you think, oh, there's no clear inciting incident, then it probably doesn't matter. But then it's sort of, quite often you do sort of see something and you think, actually, like for instance, Genesis of the Daleks, which we discussed, it's sort of like it's a great inciting incident. The protagonist's got a great goal. But then it's really interesting that his goal is genocide and he decides not to do it. So then that has made, not quite a classic formula, but that makes it interesting. Anyway, characters. I think contradictions in characters are often a kind of shortcut, or it's sort of, you really want to have loads of gay sex, but you're a Mormon or something. What I suppose it's just like, what do you want and what's stopping you? What is the situation? And I think characters having secrets. I think characters having things that they won't tell anyone is very useful.
Do you have pet hate in scripts when you see it? And I just talked about audio with bad audio writing, but in a script, if you see a character moment or a pet hates that you avoid at all, I've got a couple which I'll tell you about.
I'm sure I've got hundreds, and I'm sure we'll probably be here for hours. And another one, maybe particularly because I'm a woman, and one of my favorite genres is sci-fi, and it's what I love to write in. I hate the sort of the writer who thinks they're writing a strong female character, but they're just writing a horrible person. I think there are plenty of horrible female characters who are also great characters, but I think that depends on the writers and the people behind the show knowing that this character is horrible. I'm not going to give examples because that'd be pointing at other writers, but I can think of a few. But as an example of a good thing, one of my favorite shows is It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, where all the characters are total monsters, but the show knows they are, and that's the point. And I think sort of if your character is repellent, but the show and script seems to think the character's great, then you're in trouble, and that's a bit of a pet hate.
I absolutely. The thing that makes me cringe more than anything else in any writing is where a character overhears two people talking about the thing that they're not supposed to hear, or that will change. Just overhear. I've never overheard anything in my life. I've never stood at a door accidentally and heard, something that would change. It just and another one is somebody who has an emotional moment because they've looked at a photograph. I absolutely hate that so much. So yeah. You got any more before we move on to a bit more? I love pet hates. I think
not only did we use that, I think we actually used the emotion looking at a photograph in the Demon Headmaster as a plot device. So I'm incredibly guilty of that. But at least I suppose sometimes if you're going to do something, really lean into it.
Do it, absolutely. Lean into it.
Just a lazy shorthand. It was like this is a plot point now. This is a whole thing. Oh yeah, I know what. Yeah, because you were talking about overhearing, and that is something I consciously try to avoid where I can. Although again, I'm sure I've used it. I think one of the things, because I do quite a lot of adaptation, people often say you can get away with a lot more coincidence in a novel than you can.
Yes.
Than you can in a screenplay. And I think so quite often, my work fiddling with the plots of things might be okay in the book. This just happens to happen, but I'm not sure that'll work on screen. So what we'll have is character A deliberately engineered this thing to happen because they wanted something. So that's why that's why it happens. And I think there's a quote from some famous screenwriter which works in quite a few genres actually. I'm not saying it's always works. You can have coincidences if they make things work worse for your character.
Right.
So you can have like unfortunate coincidences, but you can't sort of have the coincidence being the thing that solves the problem.
Yeah,
that's sort of think, I'm not saying
that's good.
But I think there's a certain sense in it a lot of the time.
So how do you approach adapting a book? I've never done it, so that I'd be interested to hear what you do and what your process is.
It's always a bit different, but I think it's sort of thinking like what is the important thing about this story, that why are we taking this, and particularly if it's a book that's been sort of very successful, sort of what is it, is it a character, is it the world, and or is it the plot, and it's sort of, do I need to do any work on it, like for instance, like is it a great characters and world? I think like for instance, say with The Worst Witch, I think it's sort of like the character and world are brilliant. We want to try and keep them as faithful to the spirit of the original as we possibly can, whilst sort of creating our own plots using elements of those. Well, sort of, so I would say with The Worst Witch, it was kind of finding plots that would work for the TV format and for the stage format. And sometimes with things, there's like a premise or an idea, and it's sort of thing, actually what but the characters aren't very strong, so we'll sort of change the characters and sort of improve so sometimes look, and other times it's just sort of this is a great character, it's a great story, sort of what trajectory, what's the energy, and how do we drive this through? Because I think particularly because I've done a few adaptations of Jacqueline Wilson books, and some of her books are actually surprisingly long and sort of quite packed with incidents, and and various sort of books I've done, I think particularly maybe with children's books, it can sort of feel like you're taking a novel which is quite often this happened, then this happened, then this happened, and you're kind of making it this happened, so this happened, so this happened. Yes. And you're kind of giving it a sort of chain of causality. We were talking about years and years the other day. I was talking to some friends, and somebody said that the nuclear bomb didn't actually change the character storylines that much, and then some of us are arguing, no, actually it did, and you can see it. And sorry, apologies for spoilers, those who haven't seen Years and Years, but it's been out for years. Why
why haven't you seen it? Yes,
you can see like the decisions which Russell Tovey's character makes at the end of episode 1 because of the nuclear bomb are very much the direct cause of what happens in episode 4. So yeah, go and watch it, it's brilliant.
When you come to write your script, I suppose when you're working for BBC, you've had to go through the process of outlines and breakdowns. And, you said you love that moment when you're told to go to script.
Yes.
When you're writing stuff that you've created yourself, are you somebody who needs an outline, or do you like to make it up as you go along?
I like to make it up as I go along, but then sometimes I get nervous or intimidated. I think an outline can help, but then it feels safe to have an outline there, and then you can ignore it.
I've worked in both ways, and so the last book I wrote had a 1 paragraph outline. I sold it on a 1 paragraph outline, so I was quite happy with that, because the books I'd had to do before, I'd had to do quite detailed outlining for the publishers, which again for me, it drags some of the juice out of the story, and that's why I wanted to know from you how you.
That's a very interesting point, and I think it's and it's the sort of thing that you can get. And obviously, in my job as a lead writer, I sort of read every draft that every other writer writes of their episodes, and and sometimes I can see the fatigue setting in with the writer, and I sort of feel sorry and responsible and guilty. But I think because I know that there's another sort of writing truism that somebody says of like. Which I think is possibly just a friend of writers trying to spare themselves. But it's like, if you have a brilliant idea for a story, don't tell it to your mate down the pub.
Yes.
Because then the idea will be out of you, and you'll have kind of given birth to it, and you'll be less compelled to go and write it down. So I think there is definitely, when you've done a detailed outline and you're trying desperately to make it work, there is a sense of like, I've done that now. And it's like, oh, really? I have to go back to this story again. So that can be the sort of the difficult bit, as you know, of being a professional writer, isn't it? That we have to, I'm telling myself this much as more than anyone listening, because I'm sort of thinking of almost decent scripts that I just really need to go back and overhaul, and then I can do something with them. Going back and revisiting some work that you've done, even if you just wrote it a few weeks ago, you're a different person now.
Absolutely.
It can be quite difficult going back, can't it? But unfortunately, that kind of is the job of being a professional writer. I don't know if there's.
Oh no, I agree. Sometimes, if it's a project that I'm trying to develop myself and send out into the world, I'll write the script and then write the outline, and then write the one page. I do it backwards.
That's a really good idea. That's exactly what my agent suggested on this thing I'm working on at the moment. She's always nagging me to get more specs, particularly adult specs.
Yeah.
And she was going, well, you probably need a treatment in a Bible, but just write the script first and then write the rest.
Yeah, I've done that a couple of times. I still haven't sold them, but I've done that a couple of times. So it's different. So we're getting towards the end of our time now, and it's been amazing and brilliant. Thank you. So there are a couple of things. Now, you did say a few minutes ago that you don't want to give advice, so that's fair enough. But we do have a tradition at the end of Sledgehammer where I ask the guest what is the best bit of writing advice they've ever been given, and then follow that up with the best bit of advice they would give to other writers. And so I'm not going to let you get away with that. So I'd like to know what the best bit of advice you've ever been given, writing advice, you've been given is.
There's lots of good advice, and I think sort of I would be tempted to sort of quote Russell T Davies yet again. And I think that there are various sort of versions of this, but the idea of write what only you can write.
Yeah.
Don't be afraid to bring yourself to it. Actually, and I think. And I've heard, there are various sort of versions of this, but again, Russell did say in this event yesterday about, he was talking about the sort of the trope of the Mary Sue and how people are afraid to put a character who's like them in it because they'd be accused of having a Mary Sue, and who's going, put yourself into it, and I would say sort of like it or not, just the way that I do it is I put myself into all the characters, really. So,
even the evil ones, Emma.
Especially the evil ones. That is the sort of the downside of it that I find. Oh, no, it's a downside, but I find myself. You have to reason on behalf of the Demon Headmaster why he does what he does, and I find myself getting convinced by him. Similarly with Mary in Eve, who sort of tried to kill her daughter several times and wipe out the human race. I was often sort of quite convinced by her arguments when I thought about them.
Well, yes, you've become Sarah in Genesis of the Daleks. Yeah. which is a nice place to end this. So
I have got a sort of piece of advice.
Oh yes, go on then.
Sorry. Which is, I think this is just what I think. I think there are not as many bad ideas as you think. Or as people will tell you, it's a lot about execution. So I sort of feel that I've been put off pursuing various projects by people explaining very, very logically and very convincingly why such a thing with these attributes would never work on television, only to see something similar happen a few years later. So I said, and I'm not saying my projects or scripts were so brilliant they should have been made, but I should have kept on with that idea and making it better until people couldn't say no, is what I think. So I think don't be put off, or if people are saying to you, nobody's ever going to make this, and they're not saying because it's so badly written, but they're saying for some other reason, don't necessarily listen to them.
Brilliant. Emma, that's been fabulous. I have had the best time. Oh, thank you so much.
I've had a lovely time too.
And massive thanks, as always, to my guest this week, Emma Reeves, for her fascinating insights into Genesis of Daleks and her writing process. Join me next week on Sledgehammer, where we'll have another writer being fabulous, talking about Doctor Who and how they write stuff, and that'll be available on your podcast platform of choice.
Nebula.